She had told herself the same story for years, quietly and convincingly, that staying was the responsible thing, that enduring the silence, the distance, the small daily disappointments was a price worth paying for stability, for the children, for the appearance of a complete family. And over time, that explanation became so familiar that she almost believed it was the truth, even as the house slowly filled with an unspoken heaviness, a sense that something essential had been missing for far too long. And now, standing alone in the kitchen one evening after the children had moved out, after the noise and chaos that once distracted her had finally faded, she noticed how different the silence felt. Not busy or temporary anymore, but permanent. And in that stillness, she realized that the role she had been playing for decades no longer had an audience, because the children were grown, living their own lives, carrying memories she could no longer shape or protect. And for the first time, she allowed herself to ask a question she had avoided for years, not angrily or dramatically, but with a quiet honesty that surprised her. What was she staying for now, when the sacrifices had already been made, when the waiting had already consumed so much time? And as she looked around the room, she understood that love should not feel like endurance, that commitment should not require erasing oneself, and that staying had once been an act of care, but continuing to stay had slowly become an act of fear. And in that realization, she did not feel sudden freedom or courage, only clarity, the kind that settles deeply and refuses to leave, telling her gently but firmly that the next chapter of her life could not be built on the same silence that defined the last one. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. Not because she had somewhere to be or someone to take care of, but because her mind refused to return to the comfortable numbness it had relied on for years. And as she lay there listening to the unfamiliar quiet of a house that no longer revolved around children's schedules and late night worries, she felt an unexpected discomfort, a restlessness that came from having too much emotional space at once. Because for decades, her identity had been built around being needed, being useful, being the one who held everything together, even when nothing felt whole. And now that structure had dissolved, leaving her face to face with herself in a way she had skillfully avoided. And as she moved through the morning routine she'd repeated thousands of times, making coffee, opening the curtains, straightening things that did not need straightening, she realized how automatic her movements had become, how little intention there was behind them. And it struck her that this was how she had lived much of her life, functioning efficiently while quietly disappearing. And the thought unsettled her more than anger ever could, because it forced her to confront a painful truth that no one had explicitly asked her to vanish. She had learned to do it herself in the name of harmony. And standing there with the cup growing cold in her hands, she understood that if nothing changed now, the years ahead would stretch out exactly like the ones behind her, calm on the surface, heavy underneath. And that realization did not arrive with panic or urgency, but with a slow, deliberate pressure, as if time itself was gently insisting that she finally pay attention. Later that day, she found herself walking through the neighborhood without any clear destination, passing familiar houses she had known for years yet rarely truly noticed. And with every step, she felt a quiet tension between who she had been and who she might become, because for so long her world had been defined by responsibility and expectation that even the simple act of walking freely felt slightly rebellious. And as memories surfaced uninvited, moments where she had chosen silence over honesty, comfort over truth, she realized how often she had mistaken endurance for strength, believing that holding everything in was the same as holding everything together. And it occurred to her that no one had ever taught her how to want things for herself without guilt, how to take up space without apologizing. And this absence of permission had shaped countless decisions she barely remembered making. And stopping near a small park bench, she sat down, watching people move through their lives with the casual certainty of those who still believed time was abundant. And for the first time, she felt a sharp awareness of her own aging, not as something tragic, but as something urgent, because the years ahead were no longer theoretical, they were finite, measurable, and suddenly precious. And as the weight of that realization settled in, she understood that waiting for clarity or approval would only extend the quiet dissatisfaction she had normalized for so long. And though she did not yet know what change would look like, she sensed with unmistakable certainty that remaining the same was no longer an option she could survive. That evening, as the house settled into its familiar quiet, she stood alone in the kitchen with the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the space, and it struck her how many years of her life had passed in moments just like this, moments that felt insignificant while they were happening, but somehow added up to everything. And as she ran her fingers along the counter, she remembered how often she had postponed her own needs, telling herself there would be time later, after this responsibility, after that crisis, after everyone else was settled. And now she could see how later had slowly become a habit rather than a plan, a way of avoiding the discomfort of choosing herself. And she wondered when she had first learned to measure her worth by how useful she was to others, by how little trouble she caused, by how much she could endure without complaint. And the realization was unsettling because it meant that much of what she called loyalty had actually been fear. Fear of being seen as difficult, fear of being alone, fear of discovering that if she stopped holding everything together, nothing might replace it. And leaning against the counter, she allowed herself to imagine a different version of her life. Not dramatically different, not perfect, but honest. One where her days were shaped by intention rather than obligation. And though the thought was fragile and uncertain, it carried a quiet weight, because for the first time she wasn't asking whether she was allowed to want more, she was asking what it would cost her if she didn't. And as the room darkened around her, she understood that the hardest part of change would not be explaining it to others, but allowing herself to believe that her own dissatisfaction was reason enough to begin. The next day unfolded with a strange sense of clarity, not the kind that arrives suddenly or dramatically, but the quiet clarity that settles in after a long period of inner noise has finally worn itself out. And as she moved through her routine, she noticed how differently she was observing everything. The conversations, the pauses, the way people spoke when they assumed she would simply agree. And it became impossible to ignore how often she had been expected to adapt without question, to soften her opinions, to absorb discomfort so others could remain comfortable. And this time, instead of reacting automatically, she paused. And in that pause, she felt the unfamiliar tension of choice. Because choosing differently meant risking disappointment, risking conflict, risking the loss of roles she had played for years. And yet, the thought of continuing unchanged felt heavier than any of those fears. And as she listened to someone speak over her, dismissing a concern she had quietly carried for months, she realized that the exhaustion she felt was not from effort, but from suppression, from constantly translating herself into a version that was easier for others to accept. And that realization was sobering, because it meant that waiting for permission to change had always been an illusion, one she had clung to because it excused her from responsibility. And now, standing there with that understanding fully formed, she felt both exposed and strangely grounded, aware that growth would not arrive with applause or reassurance, but with a series of small, uncomfortable decisions that no one else would validate. And while the path ahead was still unclear, she knew one thing with certainty. Returning to who she had been would no longer feel like safety. It would feel like retreat. That evening, as the day finally slowed and the familiar quiet settled in, she found herself replaying moments she had once dismissed as insignificant, small exchanges, half-finished conversations, the subtle way her instincts had tried to speak long before her mind was ready to listen. And it became clear that the truth had never been hidden from her, only delayed by her willingness to explain it away, because acknowledging it earlier would have required action, and action would have disrupted the fragile balance she had worked so hard to maintain. And now, sitting alone with nothing to distract her, she recognized how often she had mistaken endurance for strength, believing that staying silent, staying agreeable, staying available was proof of maturity, when in reality it had slowly taught others how little resistance to expect from her, and that realization stung, not because it inspired anger toward them, but because it exposed how deeply she had participated in her own erasure. And as she allowed herself to sit with that discomfort rather than rush past it, she noticed something shift internally, a subtle reclaiming of attention, as if energy she had been spending outward was finally returning to its source. And while the uncertainty of what came next remained unsettling, it was no longer paralyzing, because for the first time she understood that clarity does not demand immediate resolution, only honesty. And in that honesty, she began to feel the early outline of a self that did not need constant reassurance to exist, a self that could tolerate temporary loneliness, unanswered questions, and the absence of approval, knowing that these were not signs of failure, but the necessary space in which something more authentic could finally begin to take shape. In the days that followed, she began to notice how differently she moved through familiar spaces, how conversations that once drained her now felt optional rather than obligatory, and how the absence of constant emotional labor created a strange but welcome quiet inside her. Because without realizing it, she had spent years anticipating reactions, softening truths, and preemptively managing disappointment that was never truly hers to carry. And as that reflex slowly loosened its grip, she felt moments of unease surface, not because something was wrong, but because she was no longer filling every silence with justification or self-correction. And in those pauses, she started to observe people more clearly, seeing patterns she had once ignored, the way some only engaged when she was accommodating, the way others grew uncomfortable when she stopped explaining herself. And rather than rushing to fix those shifts, she allowed them to exist, understanding that discomfort often reveals more truth than harmony ever could. And while part of her still feared being misunderstood or seen as distant, another part recognized that constant accessibility had never guaranteed connection, only exhaustion. And this awareness didn't make her hardened or detached, it made her more selective, more present, more capable of choosing where her energy belonged. And as she practiced this quietly, without announcements or confrontations, she realized that growth does not always arrive as dramatic change, but often as a series of small internal permissions. Permission to pause, to reconsider, to stop negotiating her worth in spaces that had long stopped honoring it. And though she knew there would be moments of doubt ahead, moments where old habits would resurface and clarity would feel fragile, she also knew something irreversible had already happened, because once you experience yourself without constant self-abandonment, returning to that state becomes increasingly impossible. As time continued to move forward, she began to recognize how deeply her old patterns had been tied not to love but to fear. Fear of being replaced, forgotten, or quietly dismissed. And this realization didn't arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a slow unfolding, appearing in ordinary moments like unanswered messages, postponed plans, or conversations that no longer required her to perform attentiveness to remain relevant. And instead of reacting with urgency, she noticed herself pausing, breathing, allowing uncertainty to exist without rushing to resolve it, which felt unfamiliar at first, almost irresponsible, because she had once believed that care was proven through constant availability. Yet now she was learning that presence chosen freely carried more weight than presence forced by anxiety. And as she reflected on past relationships, she saw how often she had mistaken endurance for loyalty, silence for maturity, and emotional restraint for strength, realizing that these traits had protected others more than they had protected her. And this awareness did not harden her heart, it clarified it, making her more attuned to what felt reciprocal rather than merely familiar. And though loneliness occasionally surfaced in this quieter phase of her life, it felt different than before, less like abandonment and more like space. Space to hear her own thoughts without interruption, space to feel emotions fully instead of filtering them for acceptability. And in that space, she began rebuilding trust with herself, not through grand promises or sudden confidence, but through consistency, choosing honesty over comfort, rest over overextension, and self-respect over reassurance. Understanding that these choices might cost her certain connections, but they would preserve something far more essential, the ability to recognize herself without apology. By the time she reached the moment she once imagined would feel like closure, she understood that endings rarely announce themselves with certainty or relief, and that what she had been waiting for all those years was not an apology, an explanation, or even acknowledgement, but permission to stop carrying questions that had never truly belonged to her. And as she looked back over the choices she had made, the compromises she had justified, and the silences she had protected, she no longer felt anger toward her past self, only a quiet compassion for someone who had done the best she could with the understanding she had at the time. And in this clarity, she felt something settle inside her, not triumph or revenge, but acceptance. Acceptance that some stories do not resolve neatly, that some truths arrive without witnesses, and that healing does not require agreement from those who caused the damage. And as she stepped into the life she was now building, she did so without urgency, without the need to prove anything to anyone, knowing that strength was no longer defined by endurance, but by discernment, by the ability to walk away from what diminished her without resentment, and to remain open without abandoning herself. And while the past would always exist as part of her history, it no longer dictated her direction, because she had learned that freedom was not found in rewriting what happened, but in choosing who she would become afterward. And with that understanding, she moved forward, not untouched by loss, but no longer shaped by it, carrying forward a quiet confidence rooted in truth, self-trust, and the knowledge that peace, once earned, does not need permission to stay.